And so we'll begin with everybody here, as long as we're okay. So on behalf of the American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Experience and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier International Program from Yeshiva University, we welcome you all, and we thank Dr. Lior Sternfeld. I keep wanting to say Sternberg. I checked it out, Sternfeld, for joining us today. I really am looking forward to this. I have had many conversations with him and they've all been interesting, so I can only imagine, and I've also heard him online. So I know we're in for a treat today. There's a lot to talk about. And so you don't want to hear from me. I will sorry, one more thing. Your cameras and microphones are off throughout the course of the presentation. Please do throw into the chat or into the Q&A, which we will be monitoring throughout. Please throw in anything. If there are technical issues, whatever, we'll do our best to take care of them. But mostly, if there are questions also for Lior, please do throw it in. And we will do our best to answer afterwards. Professor Perella, so thank you all. I'll see you at the end.
Thank you, Drora. And wonderful to be here. I want to thank the ASF and the Institute for Jewish Experience for putting this together. As always, this year has been really very full and diverse and interesting. And today, I know everyone here is excited to hear from Professor Sternfeld. I'll just give a brief intro. That Professor Sternfeld is Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Penn State. He's a social historian of the modern Middle East with a particular interest in the histories of the Jewish people and other minorities in the region. His first book, titled Between Iran and Zion, Jewish Histories of 20th-Century Iran, which came out in 2018, examines against the backdrop of Iranian nationalism, Zionism, and constitutionalism, the development and integration of Jewish communities in Iran into the nation-building projects of the last century. He's currently working on two book projects: The Origins of Third Worldism in the Middle East, that sounds pretty fascinating, and a new study of the Iranian-Jewish Diaspora in the US and Israel, another very rich, important topic that I think many here want to learn more about. Professor Sternfeld teaches courses on the modern Middle East, Iran, Jewish histories of the region, and Israel-Palestine related classes. And without any further ado, and please send questions into the Q&A. It's really wonderful to have you here, so thank you very much. And I'll
thank you, Drora and Professor Perlis and everyone in the American Sephardi Federation for organizing this talk and for this kind invitation. The story that I want to tell today is a story of transformation of the community of Iranian Jews. In 1941, the JDC, the Jewish Distribution, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, started to work in Iran. The organization was prompted to operate in Iran because of the recent arrival of hundreds of thousands of Polish refugees. About 20,000 of them were Jewish. And this is, it resonates for many reasons with the news today. I can talk more about it later, about the circumstances under which they came. But when the JDC was getting ready to work in the country, they first tried to understand what they were dealing with in terms of local population. They found that there were about 100,000 Jews living in Iran. About 10% of them belonged to the country's elites, the financial, industrial. 10% belonged to the new emerging urban middle class. And 80% were impoverished, low and lower middle classes. They were invisible part of the Iranian society, living in the geographical and social periphery of Iran. In 1977, less than 4 decades later, the JDC once again surveyed the community. And they found that once again, the number of Jews living in the country was around 100,000. 10% still belong to the country's elites, but now 80% belong to the middle and upper middle classes. Only 10% were still poor and lower classes. This is also shown in Daniela Farah's recent article that the Alliance Israelite Universelle reports showed pretty much the same data in the 1970s. And in addition to that, we see from David Seaton's comprehensive research on Sephardic communities that in 1979, 2 out of 18 members of the Royal Academy of Sciences in Iran were Jews. 80 out of 4,000 university professors were Jews, 600 out of 10,000 physicians in the country. So we really see that they were overrepresented and very much visible by the late 70s. The story of this incredible transformation is the one that I want to tell today, and the one that I was trying at least to show in my book. There's a lot to say, in the background of these developments, but I'll try to be very brief in the historical background. Some of it connected, some of these transformations are connected to the political developments in Iran. In 1925, for example, we see the end of the Qajar Empire, the Qajar monarchy that ruled Iran from the late 18th century, and the arrival of Reza Khan Pahlavi, who really tried to form a new Western secular republic modeled loosely after Ataturk's model in Turkey. And he removed many of the legal barriers that prevented minorities from integrating into the Iranian society. It's also, it happened shortly after the constitutional revolution that for the first time turned Iranian Jews and all Iranians into citizens from imperial subjects. However, during Reza Shah's period, it was iron fist rule. There was no sense of broad participation in politics. There was very heavy censorship. Zionism was a movement that operated pretty freely in Iran until the mid-1930s, and then many things changed in terms of the legislation and what was allowed and what was not allowed. But in 1941, the country was experiencing the most important, political earthshake of the first half of the 20th century, when in August 1941, the Allied armies, the British and the Soviet armies, invaded the country in order to counter the neutrality that Reza Shah declared in the Second World War. They overthrew Reza Shah and coronated his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and it really transformed the political and public sphere in Iran. When they occupied Iran, they really opened the political sphere and the public sphere to every and any political movement, including Zionism. And it also was for the first time that the Communist Party was able to regroup in a legal manner. And the political map in Iran had representation of the far right that was Nazi inspired, and there was a political party that was pretty much loyal to the Nazi party in Germany, and all the way to the radical left and the formation of the Tudeh party, the Communist Tudeh party. But also Zionist organizations could operate openly now in Iran, and Zionist organizations that were based in mandatory Palestine opened headquarters in Tehran and other Iranian cities, mostly to care for the needs of the Jewish Polish refugees that arrived in Iran. But they also started to build other community institutions and to facilitate the developments in Iran and the Jewish communities. This is actually the first major change in Jewish life. During the first 2 years of the Second World War, Iran was neutral, and so there were many Nazi operations in the country, and some of it was just disseminating Nazi propaganda, which didn't really succeed in creating widespread anti-Semitism in the form that the Nazi parties wanted. But the one political organization that openly and fiercely opposed anti-Semitism and Nazism was the Tudeh party, the Communist Party. And many Jews joined the party, first of all, as a way to be active. This was the only party in Iran that allowed non-Muslims to be fully members. And also, this was, as I said, the one party that opposed and fought against racism and anti-Semitism. And the party became very much popular in Iran. So it's also a way to think about Iranian Jews becoming part of the Iranian society, because by the end of the 1940s, the Tudeh party was the most popular party in Iran. And so many Jews found home in the Communist Party. Communist ideology was not the main reason. And also communism in Iran was meant as something different than communism in Europe, for example. It was more of a struggle for social justice against inequality, and it resonated with Iranian Jews that were also, as I said, pretty much they were in the lower classes, broadly speaking. One of my interviewees for the research was born in Tehran in the 1930s, and he joined the Tudeh party at the age of 16. He remained an active member for more than 3 decades, and his political activism landed him in Qasr, the Shah's prison, half dozen times before he left Iran. And he told me, quote, "I knew nothing about Marx or Marxism when I joined the Tudeh. I joined because this was the only place that they didn't call me Juhud, which is a derogatory term for Jews. I learned Marxism in Qasr prison shortly after I joined the party." So when the Iranian government periodically outlawed the Tudeh party, they arrested all those who were identified or affiliated with the party, and the Qasr prison actually became sort of an intellectual institution for the party. On top of that, in the 1940s, it happened simultaneously, right? Iran was the second Muslim country to recognize Israel, and was very important in the operation of facilitating the immigration of Jews from India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq to Israel. So there were camps, transition camps in Tehran and other places. So also officially, after 1948, Iran was a country where Israel was represented. I should say at this point that between 1948 and 1951, despite being, a legal legal movement in Iran, only about 17,000 Jews, Iranian Jews, chose to live for Israel. And most of them were the poorest and the neediest of Iranian Jews. So their departure to Israel was actually a sign of, or kind of relief for the community that had to invest less community resources in those people, but we'll get back to them. And I continue. I just want to follow the trajectory of political activism and to show you that Jews were also very active. I just want you to tell me that you see, that you can see the PowerPoint. Can you see it right now? Yeah?
Yep, that's perfect.
Now, yes.
So Iranian Jews, there were two communist leaning publications in Iran. One of them was Nisan and the other was Bnei Adam. And these were much more important than they would be, because in times that the party was outlawed and all the official party publications were censored, the Jewish newspapers became the mouthpiece for the party leadership. So their circulation went far beyond the Jewish communities. And some Jews were even among the top ranks of the party. But we have to remember that this was not far off in terms of ideology for most of the Iranian Jews, because Zionism was also perceived to be a very socialist movement. The socialist elements of the Zionist movement were very dominant. And in the 1940s, you know, the kibbutzim that were the pride of the Zionist movement, kibbutzim were perhaps the biggest communist experiments in human history. And so at the same point, an Iranian Jew could easily feel sympathies for Zionism, but also for the Tudeh party, and to display identity of Iranian nationalism. So multi-hyphenated identities were pretty common at the time. Iranian nationalist, communist, Zionist was something that we could see pretty often. After the establishment of Israel in 1948, the Zionist movement could no longer be considered a non-state actor, and they tried to make the case for Iranian Jews to immigrate to Israel, as was the case with other Middle Eastern countries. It worked in some cases, it failed in others. But for example, we see that 1951, almost all the Iraqi Jews left Iraq. Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria by 1956 or 1967. But in Iran, where the Zionist movement could operate openly, and the population was pretty sympathetic to Zionism, the Jews did not consider political Zionism to be their ideal solution. Rather, they were going through rapid process of urbanization, of becoming an integral part of their homeland society, and global politics helped them, ironically, to make these multi-layered nuanced identities and loyalties. In the 1950s, early 1950s, Habib Levy was one of the leaders of the Iranian Jewish community, and he wrote one of the comprehensive histories of Iranian Jews. He wrote a report for the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem, lamenting the loss of the entire young generation that preferred leftist Iranian organizations over Zionist ones. And to that mix, we can add socialist Zionist political parties, especially from the spectrum of the kibbutzi movement, that sent emissaries to Iran, and they found mutual ground themselves with Iranian socialists and communists. And we have reports of the Zionist organization in Iran that asking the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem to take back some of the representatives from APAM that started to publish op-eds and poetry in communist publications in Iran. And also, I want to share, the most important intellectual in Iran in the 20th century is Jalal Ahmad, and he himself came to Israel in 1963, and he wrote a travelogue to Israel that was very, very important. It was very confusing to some parts of the Iranian intellectual circles, and I can talk about it later too. But I want to show you something that I found in the guest book of Kibbutz Ayelet HaShachar in Israel, where he stayed with his wife, the novelist Simin Daneshvar, and they wrote, regardless of the hospitality, I saw here people I've never expected to meet, learn people, understanding, open-minded. In a sense, they are implementing plateau. Honestly speaking, I always identified Israel with the kibbutz, and now I understand why. And his wife, Simin Daneshvar, wrote, as I see it, the kibbutz is the answer to the problems of all the countries, including our own. Now, I have an opinion as a former kibbutznik, but I will not share it right now. But this is something that we see really making the case for leftist Zionism among Iranian Jews. And we see Zionist clubs and youth movements in Iran, but Iranian youth did not engage Zionism the way that Israeli officials had hoped. Zionism had become more complex than in, let's say, 1917, after the Balfour Declaration, that the existence of Iranian Jews looked very different and attracted many more Iranian Jews to imagine realization of political Zionism as a solution. So in the 1950s and 1960s, they saw Zionism differently. And the 25,000 Iranian Jews that had immigrated to Israel by that point, they also remained in touch with the Iranian Jews in Iran, because, as I said, Iranian Jews enjoyed something that almost no other Middle Eastern country had, which is the relations with Israel. There were 18 weekly flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran. Israeli companies worked in Iran. Tehran airport was a major hub for El Al. And of course, Iranian Jews who immigrated to Israel could still visit the country, and they sent letters, of course, all the time. So there were myriad stories at the time of Jews who had immigrated and returned, or immigrated to Israel and wanted to return. And the important thing was that Iranian Jews overall had a sober idea of what was waiting for them on the other side of the Zionist story, unlike any other Middle Eastern country. So a telling example is given in Stanley Abramovitz, one of the JDC directors in Iran, that he wrote a report in 1951 where he describes one instance of Jews from Nehevand. And I quote, "The letters that come from Israel dampen all spirits. The Iranian Jew is not a chalutzik, pioneer type. The ordeals of present-day life in Israel have left him discouraged, longing to return to his damp, dark ghetto room, for he has been used to that room and even liked it. Food is available in Iran, and though he earned little, he lived in an environment which was not strange to him. The language, people, life was familiar. Israel is not. As a Persian, he is looked down upon. The letters that come from Iran complain about shortage of food. Nehevand received a letter and a Torah scroll from their brethren in Iran. The Nehevand Jews in Israel signed their names on this piece of scroll, and in the accompanying letter they wrote that they took an oath by the Torah from which they sent a piece, that their brethren in Nehevand will not come to Israel now. Anyway, not until they inform them that the time is more suitable. and Nehevand is a godforsaken place in the mountains of Loristan, cut off from the outside world, yet the Lenchlight in Israel advised them, adjured them to remain in Nehevand. Another family was advised not to leave for Israel until their son Joseph is married. Joseph is 1 year old. So we see that Iranian Jews chose to support, again, Zionism was very prevalent in Iran, but different interpretation for Zionism. Israel was very visible in Iran, very active. In 1961, there was an earthquake in Qazvin, devastating earthquake. And Israel was one of the first countries to send help and support, and they had to rebuild the country and actually gained popular support from people because of that action. But also in terms of cultural representation. The Israeli embassy on Kach Street in Tehran ran Israeli Film Festival and Israeli music. And I want to share one more interesting document. This is the lineup of the cabaret Moulin Rouge in Tehran, which was very important culturally in the 1940s through the 70s. This was almost the home club of the Pahlavi family. And we see in the second row, we see the diva of Iranian music since then until today, Gugush. In the center image, it's the singer Vigan, who is also a rock star or pop star in Iran. But at the very top of the poster, we see the Israeli singer Tova Porat. That she was the headline of the club for that month. So there wasn't really an attempt to hide the Israeli presence in the country. Another way to another interesting take on interpretations for Zionism come from Elias Eshakian. Elias Eshakian was a teacher and principal of Aliyah schools in Iran for over 25 years. He wrote in his memoir, and I quote, "Iran has been my homeland, Vatan, and Jerusalem has been the source of my belief in God and my Qibla." Qibla is the direction of the prayer. Muslims, the Qibla in Islam is Mecca, and Eshakian shows that his Qibla, using the same term, is Jerusalem. This quotation suggests, yet again, that many Iranian Jews had different interpretation of Zionism than the one the Jewish Agency in Israel advanced. Eshakian was a role model for many Iranians, and it is clear that his national identity of Iranian did not interfere with his religious identity as a Jew. He proudly projected this combined identity throughout his career, which may have inspired and encouraged his students to take similar stands. Now, in the 1970s, we see, as I said in the beginning of this talk, that most Iranian Jews lived in the middle and upper middle class. They were pretty much integrated. Most of it, the facilitation of it was thanks to reforms that were taken by the Shah in the early 1940s. But the unintended consequences was that Iranian Jews at the time felt more part of the Iranian, they felt stronger affiliation with the Iranian society than they felt loyalty to the Shah for facilitating this advancement. And we see that there were many Iranian Jews active in opposition movements to the Shah. The opposition movement that saw the Shah as a brutal dictator that he was. They opposed the Savak, which is the secret police that was very much present in the life of the Iranian intellectual middle class and the middle class in general. And many of the younger generation in Iran became more or less active in many opposition movements. In March 1978, there was elections to the leadership of the community, and one of the revolutionary organizations of Iranian Jews, the Iranian Jewish Intellectual Society, actually won the elections. So in a way, the Jewish community experienced the revolution before the rest of the country did. And they were also active in some of the operations of the revolution. And I want to share another. They published a revolutionary Jewish newspaper called Tammuz. They organized participation of Jewish activists in the anti-Shah demonstrations in 1978 and early 1979. And one of the most heroic operations actually took place in the Sapir Hospital in Tehran, when during the demonstrations of 1978, 1979, there were 5 hospitals in Tehran, 4 state hospitals and the Jewish Charity Hospital. The state hospitals were forced to turn in wounded protesters to the hands of the Savak, the secret police. And the Jewish hospital made a decision that they are not going to turn in anyone, which made them a very popular destination for wounded protesters. They also collaborated with one of the leaders of the movement of the opposition, Ayatollah Talakani, and they would be informed of time and place of demonstrations and would send their ambulances first to the places so they can respond quickly. And in this way, they saved the lives of many Iranians that took to the street to protest the brutality of the Shah, and would have been taken to state hospitals and subsequently to the Savak. The hospital was off limits for the Savak and the army. One time there was a siege of 72 hours, but the Shah and the government did not allow the army to break into the hospital. The hospital later was recognized for this operation, and I have to say that some of the leaders, some of the physicians in the hospital, some of the workers were not necessarily politically identified with the opposition. Some of them were very much supporters of the Shah, but for them, this was a humanitarian mission, and this was carrying out the obligation of love thy neighbor like thyself, which is also subscribed on the gate to the hospital as a reward. After the revolution, when most institutions were nationalized, the Sapir Hospital was not nationalized, and the Jewish community could continue operate it until today. Today it's in different difficulties. We can get to it later too. The revolution is something that we have to remember did not start as Islamic Revolution. People who took to the street in 1977, 78, and 79 most of them did not want to establish an Islamic republic. They they wanted an Iranian republic, and it wasn't clear until much later that it's going to become an Islamic republic, and even then it wasn't obvious what would become of it. What does it mean to have an Islamic republic? Because there was no precedent of Islamic republic before that. So in the first few months after the Shah left Iran and after the return of Khomeini to Iran, there was a political chaos. On the one hand, there were mass executions of people who were loyal to the Shah and people of the Shah's administration. On the other hand, this was the first time in 25 years that, again, the political sphere was open to every movement and every organization. And in the drafting of the constitution, there was even a Jewish lawyer and activist, Aziz Daneshrad, who was representing the minorities in the constitution drafting committee. And he was also, he was trying to make the case for an Iranian republic also to the Jewish community, but also to the Iranian public. And there was an event on Iranian TV in June 1979 that the Iranian television hosted a 3-segment show discussion on Iranian Jews. And one of the discussions was this on Iranian Jews and nationalism, and they talked about how Iranian Jews were part of the Iranian nation, the kind of Iranian nationalism that Iranian Jews adopted. And at the end of the show, the host asked the Jewish participants, Daneshrad and a prominent Tehran rabbi, is it true that all the Jews are Zionists? And in 1979, this was a very problematic question to ask on television in any scenario, and especially on television. And the Iranian rabbi said, what is Zion? Do you know? Zion is mountain in Jerusalem. This is the biblical name of Jerusalem. If loving Zion and praying for Zion makes me Zionist, then yes, I'm Zionist, and all the Iranian Jews are Zionists. You direct your prayers to Mecca. Does it make you any more loyal to Saudi than to Iran? And for those who don't know, if there is one country that is more hated in the Iranian public than Israel, it would be Saudi Arabia. So this answer was very effective in setting the record straight. I would say that we can talk a lot about what happened with the Iranian Jewish community after the revolution, the departure of about 80% of the community in the years following the revolution. But we should say that there is still a significant community of about 15,000 Jews in Iran. It's the biggest Jewish community in the Middle East outside Israel. They are not in hiding and waiting for rescue. And I actually would like to finish this talk with an excerpt from one of my favorite memoirs on the Jewish-Iranian experience in the 1970s, and it's a Journey from the Land of No that was written by Roya Hakakian, that you were invited to another event with her tonight at Yeshiva University. And she tells about Passover Seder night at her family's house in Tehran in 1977. I quote, "Naturally, it caused an uproar at the Seder when Father asked Uncle Ardi to read the Halachma. Everyone burst into laughter even before he began. He obeyed and read, but not without a touch of subversion, a bit of mischief. This is the bread of affliction, some affliction that our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. This year we are slaves, may this slavery never end. This year here, next year at home in Israel. Pardon me for not packing. The family dreamed of the land of milk and honey, but wanted to wake up in Tehran. After reciting the halachma, Uncle Ardi asked, "So, Hakakian, are your bags packed, or is the flight to Jerusalem postponed to another year?" Father smiled and waved him away, assuming his question had been meant in jest. But Uncle Ardi, without the slightest hint at humor, pressed. "Really, Hakakian, why say it? Why not leave it at love thy neighbor like thyself and call off the rest?" Thank you very much. I would love to get your questions.
Thank you so much. Really a rich talk. So I did see, well, actually I can just, did we not have the, oh, here's Ronnie. Okay, I'm going to be able to talk, so you can take over for a minute.
Okay, I don't see any questions yet, but I'm sure they'll come in a minute. It was very rich, a lot here. You condensed a lot into a short little span. I know there's a lot here. So one of the questions I have is this, the relationship between economic mobility and political activism. You can talk about that a little bit, and the way that the Jews sought, how did they go from being so poor to being so represented? First of all, with that, I mean, you touched on it, but if you can, because this is always, you know, just an amazing question when you see any group, you know, transform itself so quickly.
I thank you for this question. I agree. This is it's a very unique development, I think, in any society, to see such a profound change within less than 40 years. Some of it is connected to, as I said, to the departure of about 17,000 of the poorest and neediest of Iranian Jews to Israel, that, you know, released many of community resources that would have been invested into them. Another thing was, and this is something that I try to show in my book, it's an interesting story because we see it with the Iranian Jewish community, but this is something that happens in Iran to the Iranian society in that time. We see, first of all, massive urbanization in this period. Many more people moved to Tehran, to Ahvaz, to other industrialist cities, and enjoyed the economic boom of the 1960s and 70s that Iran benefited from because of the oil prices and so on. Many Iranian Jews also benefited from the close relationship of Israel and Iran. Many Iranian Jews who had immigrated to Israel in the 50s came back to Iran as representatives of Israeli companies. And actually, these served as vehicle for social mobility, because they left Iran as poor Iranians, and they came back with a solid upper middle class positions and salary, and they moved straight into the newer neighborhoods of Tehran, and they had, you know, they could live different life, and also they would hire other Iranian Jews for profitable positions in the Israeli companies. Another thing, and this is what we see in the public sector in Iran, that Iranian Jews actually reap the fruits of 50 years of Jewish education prior to the beginning of this trend. Mm-hmm. The Alliance Israélite Universelle trained them in the early 1900s to position that would become available for them only 50 years later, in terms of languages, in terms of you know, being able to write, to communicate in several languages. So it's the first and second generation to that education that could actually enjoy this trend.
It was like a deep bench, right? In other words, they had real, fascinating, Huh.
They had a Jewish mother.
Do you see another question, another related, do you see a parallel with other minorities? In other words, was there something about the minority that kind of had an advantage, maybe because of the outside world? And
this is a fascinating point that unfortunately I did not develop enough in my book, but the Armenians had a similar progress, and the reason is that the Shah, for many reasons, some of it stems from sheer anti-Semitism. He believed that Jews and Christians are his bridge to the West. You know, there's a very famous interview that he gave to Mike Wallace in the 1970s. And he told him that he was very disappointed that the Jews in America did not appreciate enough what he did for them. And Mike Wallace told him, "Sir, I'm sure you realize that what you're saying here is very problematic." He said, "Why?" He said, "Because Jews don't control, I mean, you're assuming the Jews control the resources." He said, "Okay, what are you?" He said, "Jewish." "Your editor here?" "Jewish." "The owner of your station?" "Jewish." "The editor of the New York Times?" "Jewish." "The owner of the New York Times?" And then he started to count people in the administration. And okay, so now we know that the presence of these people in these power positions doesn't mean that they got there because they were Jewish. But for the Shah, this was part of the Jewish control that he wanted to benefit from. He didn't come as, you know, complaining about Jewish power. He said, "I want to enjoy this Jewish power." And he said similar things to Barbara Walters in 1976 about the ungratefulness of American Jews. But for him, Jews and Christians were bridge to the West. And so they enjoyed more freedoms and liberties than perhaps you would expect from a pretty authoritarian society. Because, as I said, I mean, only the Jewish hospital in Tehran enjoyed the defense of the legal status when the Savak and the army could not break in. And this was because it was important to defend the territory of the Jewish community, or the Christian community for that matter.
Wow.
I hope that I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I'm sure there's more to it, but that was very helpful. I think
I did say, what about the Jewish mothers? But maybe deeper than that, what role did women play in all of this? Because I think they did a lot, quietly, behind the scenes.
Women did a lot in many ways, and sometimes in contrast to what they were expected by the Jewish leadership. There were many Jewish women who were, you know, as their generation were very educated. They also joined literary clubs that were, in other names, opposition groups. Some of them asserted their position within, you know, the Jewish society, and I can recommend a couple of memoirs that show the Jewish women's perspectives. Roya Hagakian is one of them. Jacqueline Saper, from miniskirt to hijab, is another very good memoir. But also, I just finished writing an article with Janet Afari, Professor Janet Afari, about the struggle of Iranian Jewish feminists to change the inheritance laws in Iran and in the Jewish community. So, and they were met with fierce opposition from the Jewish leadership. Iran in 1975 passed what was called the Family Protection Law, which really was the biggest feminist achievement of Iranian women in the 20th century. It granted them the right to initiate divorce, the right to keep children in case of divorce, the right for inheritance, and so on. And the Jewish leadership quietly asked to exclude Iranian Jewish women from the law. Now, at the same time, few years earlier, Israel passed similar law, the inheritance law in Israel, 1965. And the Iranian Jewish feminists asked why women in Israel can inherit, can initiate divorce, can do things that we here, when the country already moved to that place, we cannot do it. And they started a struggle that was, they got help from Israeli rabbis, Sephardi rabbis, such as Ovadia Yosef, who came to Tehran for 3 months and dismantled the Bet Din in Tehran and established a new Bet Din to deal with claims. There was Rabbi Shlomo Iluz, also wrote halacha writings to help Iranian women with this process. But I mean, so Iranian Jewish women were very active on many fronts. So I mean, you have to invite me for another talk.
Why would the community want to be exempt?
Because it was very in the structure. It was seen as, you know, preserving the tradition. It was very patriarchal society. They didn't want to shake the foundations too much, and this was seen as a step too far.
Yeah.
But
they allowed the women to go study.
Yeah, absolutely. But this was something that, again, they were pretty much. I mean, this was the Iranian law would not have let them otherwise.
Oh, okay. So it was just because they were forced into it.
I don't think that they would try to prevent women if they could. They wouldn't try to prevent women from getting studies, but inheritance and divorce were
different things. There's a question from the director of the ASF, Jason Guberman. Jason,
Take it open. You want to open your mic?
Thanks, Ronnie. Hi, thanks again, Lior, for this great presentation. I really appreciate you coming and sharing your perspectives with us. I've had this conversation with Roya, and I'm curious for your take on it, and also specifically in the Jewish dimension of it. So that we've talked about the disaffected left, how many people surprisingly supported Ayatollah Khomeini initially. Including like justifying things like the chador as proletarian garb. So I'm curious, were there Jews involved in that part of the movement in providing a philosophical, ideological basis for this?
Look, the short answer is yes. The number is not very big, but you have to understand that in 1979, people believed that Khomeini is just the glue that allowed this broad coalition of Iranian organizations of all walks of life and all the political map to be together to remove the Shah, and then he will go to his seminar in Qom. They didn't expect him to actually become the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. This was not in the cards for them. This was not something that they wanted. This is not something that took them to the street. But many of them saw Khomeini, who was also very clever in his usage of leftist jargon to create the political platform on which he returned to Iran. So the short answer is yes, and I hate to do the what if game, but but I think that you know, if immediately after the return of Khomeini, he returned to Iran on February 1st. In early March, he declared the first mandatory hijab law it wasn't yet a law, but he declared that it's going to become a law. And on March 8th, 1979, few days later, International Women's Day, we saw a march of millions in Tehran and other cities, including women who only few months earlier took to the street in the name of right to wear hijab, went bareheaded to protest against this decision of Khomeini. In a way to mock this decision, men wore hijab just to ridicule Khomeini. And as a result, he said that it was only a recommendation, it wasn't going to become a law anyway. So the pushback succeeded, he rolled it back. And he reinforced it only after the beginning of the Iran-Iraq war, that, war situation makes everything possible. And everyone has to unite under the banner of the leader, or otherwise you're a traitor. So the actual time that the Islamic Republic cemented its position was after the Iran-Iraq war started.
Yes, and a second question, more contemporary for you. Thank you so much. We always get asked about the numbers of Iranian Jews, and we've seen numbers as high as 25,000. There is a purported census from 2012 that says less than 9,000. So what is the right number?
All right, so this is a very contested issue, and the best answer that I can give you is that no one knows. But we know that the Iranian census intentionally reduced the numbers by a lot, because it has a lot to do with allocation of budgets, it has to do with representation of minorities in the parliament, it has to do with many other bureaucratical decisions. The Armenians argued that they are undercounted by 40,000. I say that the Jews are undercounted by something like 6,000 or 7,000 Jews. In an interview last summer, the chief rabbi of Iran said that the numbers in Iran are between 15 and 20,000 based on community registration. So not based on people who are registered in Jewish institutions throughout the country. I don't know, some of the Iranian Jews live part of the time in the country and share their residency between Iran and other countries. So maybe they count them too. I think that the numbers are around 15,000 or so.
Thank you.
Okay, Stan had a question about intermarriage. If you're talking about the rights there and the, I guess, the more conservative nature of the community, he wrote, I assume there wasn't intermarriage, but let's not assume anything, we'll ask.
There is, there is intermarriage. It's in the margins of the society. It's very small number. Iranian Jews go to great length to find matches among Iranian Jewish communities in Iran and outside Iran.
Even among,
what's that?
even among the secular.
Yeah. I mean, it exists, and there are many Iranian Jewish families with, especially in the period of the Shah, before the revolution. I think that it was more common then to have intermarriages, and even then we have some reports that it's about 2 to 5%.
Okay. Thank you. I don't want to take too much more time, but we really appreciate it. We only went over 3 minutes, so that's good. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Lior, for a really enlightening talk. And as usual, we have to go back, process it, and figure it out. So thank you again. I didn't ask you officially, but I'll ask you now if that's okay. I don't know if you want it to be live on YouTube or if that's okay, that we can follow up with it after.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, you can say no. I just we like to have it available for those who have, and please make sure the link for his book will be in your follow-up emails. So just so you know. And thank you again. Thank you all for joining, and thank you for the questions. So I hope to see most of you tomorrow too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Hoda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.